Good evening, friends. My name is Joseph Gerson, and I'm privileged to welcome our speakers and all of you on behalf of the Campaign for Peace, Disarmament, and Common Security, and our co-sponsors, the Massachusetts Peace Action and Brooklyn for Peace. I'll keep my introductory remarks to a minimum so that we have as much time as possible for our three deeply knowledgeable and experienced panelists, Professors Richard Falk, Asaf Kafoury, and Irene Genzier. Even as we were shocked by and condemned the abominations of the brutal massacres of nearly 1,200 Israelis on October 7th, we and most of the world's nations stand horrified by what is widely understood as the IDF's genocidal assault against civilians in Gaza and by the escalating settler violence and land seizures in the West Bank. An estimated 23,000 Gazans, the vast majority of them children and women, have been killed in Gaza. That's roughly 20 times the number of Israelis killed in October. If we translate that proportionately into US numbers, it's the equivalent of more than 3 million US people. 70% of Gazan homes have been destroyed, with 85% of Gazans displaced. The UN humanitarian chief describes Gaza as uninhabitable, with water, food, and fuel still in desperately short supply, and hospitals no longer functioning. Hundreds of thousands of people face death from famine, thirst, disease, and lack of medical care. Yet the war goes on, even as the IDF broadcasts that it is moving into a new and more surgical phase of the war. It threatens that massive bombings may continue. Prime Minister Netanyahu pledges that the war will continue for 9 months to a year, and powerful currents in his government, the Netanyahu government, are pressing to ethnically cleanse Gaza's 2 million people, another Nakba. And as we see from the Hezbollah-Israeli exchanges along the border with Lebanon, bombings in Syria and Lebanon, targeted assassinations in Lebanon and Iraq, and the Houthi attacks in the Red Sea, the danger remains that the war could explode into a regional cataclysm. President Biden's embrace of Prime Minister Netanyahu and massive US weapons transfers to Israel have made what appears to be a genocide possible. It is also having broader and longer-term international ramifications. The US, as we see in UN votes, is increasingly isolated, accelerating the relative decline of the US Western Empire and the emergence of a still very fluid and thus uncertain and dangerous multipolar world system. There is also the tragic domestic fallout here in the US. In 1948, Hannah Arendt, the German Jewish refugee philosopher, herself a non-state Zionist, warned that, justified or not, Jews around the world would be judged by how Israelis treated their Arab neighbors. The savaging of Gaza now compounds apartheid Israel as a pariah nation, as well as the historic currents of anti-Semitism. The aggressive distraction defense practiced by Israel and the functional alliance between U.S. apologists for Israeli apartheid and the hard right in Congress, in our universities, and elsewhere, is hastening the war on truth and what remains of the foundations of U.S. democracy. These are very hard times. The need for a ceasefire and a credible process toward a just Israeli-Palestinian and Middle East peace are urgent necessities. My hope is that this evening's webinar will provide the historical background and current analyses that will add to pressure to end the killing and the apartheid, and toward a peace that respects the dignity and rights of both Palestinians and Israelis. A few words then about our format before I introduce our panelists. We'll begin with 2 rounds of questions. I'll then give our speakers the opportunity to push back or question one another, and finally we'll move to our question and answer period. I expect that all of you are veterans of this process, but just to remind you that if you have a question you'd like to pose, please use the Q&A button at the bottom and center of your computer screen to post your question. The chat function is inoperative this evening, and I need to ask that you limit your Q&A post to actual questions, so I don't have to struggle to find them through a clutter of comments. Okay, then I could spend the next hour introducing our evening speakers, but I'll briefly introduce them in the order that they'll be speaking. It has been my privilege to know and to work with each of them over more decades than any of us may want to admit. Yesterday, I found notes from a meeting that Irene Asaf and I had with Senator Kennedy during Israel's 1982 invasion of Lebanon. It says a whole lot about where we are and what hasn't moved and why we're in the situation we're in now. Irene Genzier is professor emerita at Boston University, and with its departments of history and political science, and is also a member of the African Studies Center. She is currently an affiliate in research at the Harvard Center for Middle East Studies. Her published works include Notes from the Minefield, United States Intervention in Lebanon and the Middle East, 1945 to 58, France Fanon, a critical study. She's the co-editor with our other speaker, Richard Falk, as well as Robert Lifton, of Crimes of War, and the author of Dying to Forget, Oil, Power, Palestine, and the Founding of U.S. Policy in the Middle East. She is currently working on a study of U.S. policy in Palestine, Israel, 1948, titled Does Knowing Matter? That's been the question. Asaf Kaffouri is a Lebanese Palestinian mathematician and professor in the computer science department at Boston University. And like Irene, he is a longtime associate of Noam Chomsky. His articles include The High Price of Speaking Out in Egypt under Sisi, Washington's favorite dictator, and Preparing for War with China while the planet is already on fire. Richard Falk is the Albert G. Milbank Professor Emeritus of International Law at Princeton University, and he served as the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in Palestine. He is currently the co-convener of SHAPE, Save Humanity and Planet Earth. His books include Chaos and Counter-Revolution, After the Arab Spring, and Reimagining Humane Global Governance, as well as Revisiting the Vietnam War, and on nuclear weapons, denuclearization, demilitarization, and disarmament. We will start with Irene. And Irene, let me ask you, a lot of people have not been following developments in the Middle East and are coming new to the crisis. So if you could kind of lay out, I hate to say it quickly, how we got here, kind of a quick review of history, beginning with the origins of the conflict.
Okay, so let me tell you that one of the astonishing, perhaps, and depressing aspects of reviewing this material, which, by the way, is accessible to anybody who has a computer at hand. Just for start, you might go to something called FRUS, Foreign Relations of the US, 1948, look up Israel, Palestine, and that will take you on a long, long journey. That's one of the many sources that I've used. What is striking to me in reviewing this material is if you go back to the period prior to the establishment of Israel, that is the mandate period of the post-World War I, that included Britain's power as a mandatory authority in Palestine. The problems that we have today existed at that time. In other words, there was utter clarity about the fact that the Palestine mandate was riven, divided by forces, Jewish forces on the one hand, Zionist forces seeking the establishment of a state, Palestinian forces resisting such an outcome. There were a series of reports that were issued by US sources, including the CIA, in 47 and 48, throughout those years on the situation in Palestine. They are extremely revealing. This material is available online, as I mentioned. They are revealing in a sense that they indicate the clarity with which the US, Washington, understood the conflict, understood the differences, was very cautious and calculating in its decision to back Israeli forces after May 48. The calculation was based on an assessment of US regional interests, with the belief that Israel's superior military forces would probably have a long-term impact in the region, and it was useful for the US to not to confront in a negative sense these forces, but rather to co-opt them, cooperate with them in supporting its own interests, meaning Arab oil. It looks from afar as a very odd combination, but in practice it wasn't. Insofar as Palestine was concerned, the sad truth is that US officials, CIA, White House, they understood the conflict and at the same time decided that it was, if you want, a secondary matter that had the potential to disrupt broader US interests. So if you look at US reports in the fall of 1947, October, November through February 48, March 48, the Declaration of Israel's independence, and July, the summer of 48. What I found of interest, and as I say, disturbing, was the US position, which was first to calculate what impact this might have on US-Soviet rivalry in the region. Once that became clear, then a more narrow focus on the situation within Palestine, and a very a clear assessment that Palestinian forces, or those Arab forces supporting Palestinian forces, were militarily inferior to what became Israel after May 48, and therefore were not worthy of US support. There were differences in the US government. That is to say, if you look at Department of State, CIA, Department of Defense, there was by no means total unanimity, but there was total clarity about what was going on, about the forces involved, and about the possible consequences. Ultimately, the decision of what to be done was based on the impact that Palestine would have on US regional interests, meaning US support for the oil producing states. That perhaps is the general conclusion that this material leads to. Now, there was a very clear view also that moves to partition Palestine were vehemently opposed in the Arab world, supported within Jewish circles in Palestine, but with some questions, and that partition was nonetheless the probable and the most favorable outcome that the US could expect from the situation in Palestine. So the CIA reports on the consequences of Palestine for November 47, February 48, yield a view of the Palestine problem not different from what we are looking at today. Let me put this material aside for a moment and point to something very different. And that is to say, media report of the Palestine situation in this period. I came across a copy of The Nation magazine, which I'm sure all of you know, called The Palestine Problem and Proposals for Its Solution. Date in November, May 1947. The title is The Palestine Problem, but there is not one mention of Palestinians in the discussion of the Palestine problem. The Palestine problem is viewed in the context of World War II and the situation of European Jewry after that period. The proposals for its solution involve support for the creation of a Jewish state in Palestine. And there is an abridged version of a memorandum that was presented by this particular group to the General Assembly of the United Nations. The group involved the editor of the Nation Associates. That also is available online. What does this leave us with? What did it leave me with? The realization that 47 was not an enlightened period in terms of understanding Palestine and its consequences with respect to partition and its internal problems.
Irene, thank you so much, and I'm sorry to be cutting you short. But I look forward, among other things, to the Q&A period when we can go deeper. Asaf, among other things, you've been looking at what's been happening in the Arab media, recent polling, and when we were talking before, you indicated something potentially quite interesting coming out of Saudi Arabia. If you could kind of share those with us, that would be wonderful.
Okay, thanks, Joe. So Joe this morning drew my attention to an article that appeared in New York Times that this is in relation to the meeting between Anthony Blinken and MBS, the de facto ruler in Saudi Arabia. And the question that came from Joe is to what extent that article is reflecting things that are really happening in the Arab countries. So he was asking me to go and read things in Arabic in the press and see to what extent what is reported in New York Times correspond to what I could read in the Arabic press. What is in the New York Times? Yes, it is reproduced in the Saudi press, the Gulf press, and some of the London-based newspapers. They report typically the diplomatic language, and it sounds as if everybody is in harmony between the US and the Arab oligarch. But what is missing, I think, is that when you read the opinion pages in these newspapers, you get a different feeling. Okay, they don't say everything they could say. I mean, if you say exactly what you think in, say, in Egypt or Saudi Arabia, it's risky. You may end up in prison, so you have to be careful. But nevertheless, there's a sense that the mood among the public, the people who speak up, is a bit different from what is being said in the press conferences when Blinken was there and MBS was there. What I've done after getting the message from Joe earlier this morning is that I went to look for some of the polls that are in Arabic. And some are very good. I mean, there's one person that by the name of Khalil Shikaki, who works out of Ramallah in the West Bank. He's very good in collecting the information, in polling people and finding out, asking different questions. Earlier this afternoon, I looked up, there's in Doha, in Qatar, there is an institute that collects information, and they have just published today, a long report on a survey of, and they asked more than 8,000 people. I'm reading from what my translation here. They asked more than 8,000 people across 16 Arab countries. A different question. They're all very relevant. I'm not going to read all the statistics in front of me, but for example, there's still a very strong identification at the popular level in favor of the Palestinian, of course, yeah, but it has increased also in recent days. So more than 60% that follow the news on Gaza on a daily basis. About 10% don't follow the news on a daily basis. And we're talking about countries that go all the way from Morocco all the way to Iraq and the Gulf. Okay, so it's widespread. And then one of the statistics that is really telling as to the mood is, for example, that more than 96% of the Saudi would be in favor of cutting ties with Israel because of the war in Gaza. Well, it's a very high percentage. And only 16% of the Saudis that were asked said that Hamas should stop calling for the destruction of Israel. So like a majority are going along with Hamas and supporting the Hamas in the war with Israel. There are many other questions that are very relevant also, that says, they ask people, this is the institute in Doha in Qatar, asking people how they feel about Hamas also, to what extent they think Hamas is the fault of what is happening. I'm going to read this and then I stop. I mean, I have more information I can give later. So I'll give you some of this information. 94% view the policy of the United States toward the war in Gaza as bad or very bad. 94%. 81% think the US is insincere about supporting the two-state solution. They don't believe that. Whatever the Biden administration thinks it is doing with its messaging, obviously, it is not working in these Arab countries. Other Western countries don't do much better, by the way. Russia and China get about 40% approval. That's not very good either, but better than the United States. No state outside the Arab countries has a majority positive view, but Iran's policy is viewed as good or very good for 49%. So it's not a majority, but close to about half of the people. And Turkey gets 47% approval. And then there are, for example, I mean, one should take this also with I think, be careful making a big conclusion, because none of the countries that are part of the so-called Abraham Accord have broken or said something that they are going to break relations with Israel. So the two main Gulf states that are part of the Abraham Accord, United Arab Emirates and Bahrain, they make some statements that they don't like what Israel is doing, but they're not threatening to cut. So that's one thing. And the other thing is that the people that, okay, the two other countries that joined the Abraham Accord, Morocco and Sudan, haven't said anything publicly either on that. So what I see in this is that at the level of the ruling classes and the oligarchs, I mean, they are trying to say what Blinken and Biden would like to hear from them, and they do certain things to accommodate the public opinion, but the public opinion is not coming through in the West. I'm going to stop here because my time is up.
Thank you, Asaf. You know, listening to that and knowing we don't read that in the U.S. media, I find myself hoping that on the other side of this webinar, there's an article from you that summarizes that to make it more publicly available. Richard, we want to turn to you to ask you about kind of the regional and international implications of the war. What are we seeing in terms of this reverberations? What does it mean in terms of where we're all headed in the coming years?
Well, one interesting way of responding, Joe, would be to recall Samuel Huntington's 1993 article, The Clash of Civilizations, which ends with the provocative phrase, the West against the rest. And one of the striking features of the way in which the external alignments have developed is you find that the pro-Palestinian active forces are all on the Islamic side of the civilizational border or fault line, whereas those that support Israel in an active way are in the European colonial states and the white settler colonial states, of which the United States is the leading one. And the originality of this situation is quite extraordinary because it is the states supporting Israel that have tried to occupy the high moral and legal ground in international political life and have chastised and criticized others for failing to be sensitive to the obligations of international law, of UN Charter, and so on. So you have a situation that has never existed before in relation to what increasingly seems a transparent example of severe genocide. You have the countries that supposedly were championing a world of democratic respect for human rights and law on the side of the genocidal actor, and not taking any, not only withdrawing from any active effort to prevent genocide, which is a central obligation of the Genocide Convention, but actually being complicit in providing material, intelligence, and diplomatic support throughout this crisis period. And in other words, to me, the actuality of genocide is complemented by these complicity crimes. And they're not included in this very timely South African initiative before the International Court of Justice that is seeking provisional measures to stop the genocide on the basis of evidence that's overwhelmingly documented in an 84-page, very well-crafted application for this sort of relief. So it's a very unusual, malevolently unusual situation in international life, where you have international law demeaned by those states that have historically championed its relevance and now oppose what seems like a strikingly reasonable appeal to the International Court of Justice by saying that that initiative is legally baseless, and Israel has said it's a blood libel against the Jewish people. So we have a situation in it growing out of the carnage in Gaza and the spillover in the West Bank, which is really engulfing the entire world in one sense, in a new kind of normative tension. And the other thing I would like to say in response to your question quickly is that Israel seems caught now between not being able to win nor being able to afford politically to lose. And their only option in that kind of situation, if I'm correct in assessing it in this way, is to expand the war and draw Iran into an active conflictual relationship that would in turn draw at least the US into the conflict, and maybe using the pretext that Iran is close to acquiring nuclear weapons as the basis for launching an attack. So it's a very precarious situation, which has no logical, plausible way of ending at this point, and has been horrifying up to this stage. And so it's hard to know what to do, even if the International Court of Justice does impose these provisional measures and order Israel to desist from further violence in Hamas until the substantive decision is reached. It's unlikely that Israel will obey. Israel has consistently defied international law, and therefore there's a crisis of implementation. The law is there, but the political will to enforce it isn't present.
Richard, I wish I could say I disagreed with you. It's definitely chilling. Let me then ask each of you to quickly. It's one thing to understand the world. The other thing, of course, is to change it. What would each of you advocate as or suggest that what 380 people on this call might think about doing to stop the killing and to prevent a wider war? And maybe Irene has her hand up. Thank you.
Well, I think the first thing I would ask is for the US to make totally public the amount of arms, economic and military aid it provides Israel, and to consider halting military aid to Israel at the present time.
Well,
Asaf?
yeah. Okay. I'm going to try to be a bit optimistic here. I'm all for what Irene just proposed, but I think that what is going on right now in the United States in particular, I know it's not happening in Washington. It's not happening among the political class, but at a lower grassroots level, there's a lot of things going on. And I've been long enough in this country to see, for example, that the people who are at the forefront of building up pressure from below are groups like Jewish Voice for Peace, or If Not Now. And this gives me a lot of good feelings about what could happen. And I'm not saying it's going to change the policy of the United States overnight, but this is the kind of pressure that has to be built up. It is building. I mean, this is happening all across the country. I happen to be, like all of us here, the panelists are academics. We know that at the level of the administration, there are all kinds of pressures that they cannot speak the way they should. And they're doing all kinds of things that are very deplorable, the way they've been pushing out some university presidents. But I also see, because I see talking to students or people who are at the lower level, there is a lot of feelings for doing something that could put pressure maybe on their representatives, on the senators. And that is part of a movement to build up pressure in this country to push the people who make the decision in Washington to move in a different direction. I think, for example, Mr. Biden is in a bind right now. They say that some of the groups in the United States that put him in, that voted for him, I'm talking, for example, about the Arab American, there is a large group of them in the state of Michigan. They're so disgusted with the policies followed by Mr. Biden and Blinken. They're not going to vote for him. Okay. I mean, it also poses the other issue. I mean, if Biden is not elected, then we have Mr. Trump, who is worse. But nevertheless, there is something here that things are shifting. There's a dynamic that could be developed further. I don't know. Okay, yes, the election is coming soon, and that could be something to plan more carefully but there is a movement going on right now. I feel at the lower level, at the grassroots level, it's going the right way. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Asaf. I share your thinking. At the end of the session, we're going to post information about the global days of action for Gaza this coming Saturday, which people can join. Richard, what do you say?
Well, I think very much along what Irene and Asaf have been saying. As far as specific measures are concerned, I think in addition to making more transparent the degree to which the U.S. has supplied weaponry from U.S. taxpayer money would be an important supplement to the kind of rethinking of the relationship to Israel that is so important to take place. I would think that also proposing an arms embargo in the General Assembly and perhaps in the Security Council would have considerable symbolic and possibly substantive value. And the third specific thing to give, I think would be timely, would be a people's tribunal dedicated to people's tribunal of persons of conscience dedicated to clarifying and documenting what has happened since October 7th and providing an opportunity for the peoples of the world to speak, including pointing to the failures of the intergovernmental system to take any kind of effective protective action. And where I very strongly agree with Asaf is the best hope of the Palestinians is the mobilization of civil society at this stage. And the South African initiative is important because if this court gives a positive result to South Africa, it will escalate the popular participation through global solidarity, activism and pressure for boycotts in sports, culture, and other domains. That proved very successful in the struggle against South African apartheid. And Israel is becoming a pariah state that has made itself, through its behavior, through the outrageously open acknowledgement of genocidal intent, a pariah country or a rogue state. And this is a moment where civil society can produce a new balance of forces in the world. And if one looks at all the colonial wars, they were won by the weaker side militarily. And that's an important lesson for the 21st century, that it isn't weapons that control political outcomes. The US should have learned that in Vietnam, where it won every battle, had total superiority in land, air, and sea, and yet lost the war. And it couldn't learn. See, part of the problem is it's unable to learn those kinds of lessons because of the strength of the military-industrial complex, the arms industry, the global geopolitical role being played by the US, all the military bases. So one's in a kind of dilemma where we know what we should be doing, but there's no way to get it done.
Thank you, Michael, and Richard. Jumping ahead of myself here, there's a question from Michael Clare. Actually, I've got a couple of them here. Hold on one second. My great technological abilities here. Hold on. We're going to start with this. This is a question for Asaf. You say that public opinion in the Arab world is strongly in support of the Gazan people and angry at the U.S. Arab elites remain tied to the U.S. To what degree will that public opinion actually have any political impact on those countries?
Good question. Right now, what we have seen is large mobilization, say in Jordan, and also large mobilization in other, like in Tunisia, in North Africa, but not to the point where the governments are taking an open public stand in support of doing something. For example, why can't some of these countries make a public support the South African suit against Israel? Jordan has done that, but what we read also, that this is something that I was reading earlier today, this has happened in part because of public pressure in Jordan. Now, something that happened about 2-3 hours ago, I don't know if this is correct, but I heard someone sent a message. I received a message saying that Saudi Arabia decided to support the South African suit. This is interesting because only yesterday, MBS, the ruler of Saudi Arabia, the Prince Mohammed, was meeting with Blinken and saying things that we are all in harmony. We agreed together. And Blinken made a statement saying that the suit, that the South African suit has no merits. And they made their statement to the press. And then today, if this is correct, I received this message a couple of hours ago, is that Saudi Arabia decided to support the South African initiative. One can take this in different ways. I mean, one can say, okay, it's MBS and Saudi Arabia trying to say, we are not following directives from the United States. We do things independently. Okay. I mean, there are limits to that. Or it could be that within the ruling circle in Saudi Arabia, some people, and there are some indications to that, are not too happy with the way MBS is pushing the whole game. And I would like to assert some distance from that. But in answer specifically, is there something that is going to, I mean, is there going to be pressure to the point where the king of Jordan is going to do something more dramatic? I don't see it yet. I don't know. I just mentioned earlier that none of the Abraham Accord countries have broken with Israel. They're still there. There are 4 countries, Saudi Arabia, no, not Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and then at the distance, there's Morocco and Sudan. And Morocco and Sudan got in because of some bartering with the United States. Sudan was told that if you join, then we're going to remove you from the list of states sponsoring terrorism. And so they joined. And then Morocco was told, okay, you join, and then the United States recognized the sovereignty of Morocco over the Western Sahara. This is something they wanted for a long time. So there was kind of back and forth exchanges, but the 2 countries that were very eager to be part of the Abraham Accord, Bahrain and United Arab Emirates, have not done anything official that will break a relation with Israel. More than that, I could say, Bahrain, even though it was not, I didn't see it in the U.S. press. Bahrain is part of the group of countries that are trying to do something about the Red Sea situation. I mean, you followed that some of the ships that are going through the Red Sea are being bombarded or something by the Houthis in Yemen. And okay, the UK, United States, and different countries are joining to try to do something about that. One Arab country had joined in this effort, not United Arab Emirates. Bahrain had joined. But it's a small place where they don't have an army. I mean, it's nominal. Well, so nothing so far, but probably if this continues, something more dramatic can happen.
Thank you, Asaf. A lot of questions here. Try to sort my way through them. Since we've been talking about the International Court of Justice, there's a question from Jeffrey Weiss. Any prediction on how the 15 judges at the World Court will vote later this week on a cease and desist order. Maybe this should go to Dick, given his academic specialty here.
Well, it's very hazardous to predict judges in a case that's so politically salient. We don't know which judges are susceptible to pressures from their governments and how independent these judges feel in a case that some governments are very dedicated to having decided one way or the other. And incidentally, there's 17 judges because each party, Israel and South Africa, can appoint an ad hoc judge, which they've done. So I think on the basis of the evidence and juristic integrity, there should be a 17-0 vote. So it's a matter of how much the politics and the primacy of geopolitics distorts that juridical analysis. And I'm not able to see much in the crystal ball that would give me a number that would be satisfying. I certainly am hopeful that it will be a substantial majority that will support the initiative.
Thank you, Dick. So a question from George Smith. If, inshallah, the U.S. decided to use the full power of its leverage to bring about an immediate, unconditional ceasefire in Gaza, could it succeed? Who wants to take this on?
Repeat, what is the question?
The question is, if the U.S. decided to use its full power, the full power of its leverage, to bring it about an immediate and unconditional ceasefire in Gaza, could it succeed? Does the United States have that degree of power and influence? Irene, maybe to you?
Well, the question really is, I mean, there are many questions in this question. One is, why the hesitation to demand a ceasefire? The answer is that the Israelis have not wanted a ceasefire, since the absence of such gives them an advantage that they can continue as they have been doing. Will the US then break its intimate accord with Israel, informal with Israel, and say, no, we demand a ceasefire at the present time? I don't know. Maybe the answer in part has to do with the kind of external pressure that the US is facing, the kind of pressure that Asaf mentioned and that Richard mentioned now, that the US is facing in the current situation. Maybe they will take that step. If they do, I think that it will be a significant break or significant shift or significant reassessment in US-Israeli relations, which would be to the good. So I strongly hope for that. I think that insisting on holding back on a ceasefire is shameful from a humanitarian point of view, and really exposes the US, the kinds of interests that move the US policy.
Thank you. Anyone else want to comment?
Well, I think the way George asked that question, I have no disagreements with Irene on that, but the way George asked that question is that it's a hypothetical question. What if the United States, by some magic, is going to say, stop? Then what? What will Israel do? Well, the reality, well, leaving aside whether the United States is going to do that, but if the US were to say, stop, my view is that Israel will have to stop. Israel cannot continue on its own. They're using, I mean, its economy, its army, everything is totally integrated into the United States. And there are cases in the past where, for example, I don't have the exact date, where they were trying to send maybe something Joe, remember, sends some technology to China, and the United States say, don't do that, stop, you can't do it. And they stopped. There are other cases in the high tech, things that they wanted to do on their own. And the United States stepped in and said, you cannot do that, and they had to stop. So my view is this, is that it's very hypothetical, but if ever the United States come to the point and say, you stop, don't do it, Israel will have to follow suit. It will create a total upheaval in Israel itself. Sure, okay, so there'll be some kind of a internal revolution or something. And it could be also here in the United States, some upheaval within the ruling classes. But, and this is all hypothetical. I mean, if the United States come to the point, if the ruling class in the United States come to the point of saying, stop, Israel would have to stop.
Thank you, Asaf. And one of the other things, I think the question points to the question ultimately of moral and political responsibility, hypothetical or otherwise. So a question from our friend Carolyn Eisenberg, Rusty. Can any of the speakers comment on political attitudes of our NATO allies on the conflict? Is there any willingness among those governments to adopt a more critical attitude toward Israel?
Well, all of our allies have been more critical than the US. So really the issue is not so much the relationship between our allies and Israel, but our allies and the US government. And there I think that there's a broader question. To what extent does the situation in Gaza really impede, in any way affect that broader set of relationships? I think that's very, very important. If the price of the war, supporting the war in Gaza, is not high enough such that the European states feel moved to openly criticize the US, then we're in difficulty. But I think that's shifting for reasons that Asaf implied, and that is public opinion, global public opinion, demonstrations globally against the continuation of war. So that, I don't know if that answers some of Rusty's questions.
I mean, just to say that demonstrations in London have been amazing. And I can imagine the British government is feeling at least some pressure. There's a question from Anthony Donovan. Appreciates the information and perspectives of each of you. Question here is concerned about the constant reference to Iran as supporting terrorism throughout the region. Richard, could you shed some light on the degree to which, maybe Asaf as well, in which Iran is involved in supporting terrorism or not?
Yes, I can try. Of course, there is a huge propaganda effort to tie Iran to everything that has happened that has produced this crisis, starting with the October 7th Hamas attack. You notice even in the mainstream print media like the New York Times, they always refer to Iran-backed Houthis or Iran-backed Hezbollah or Iran itself, a proxy of Iran. And this is trying to create a consciousness that Iran is our major enemy in the region, and at the same time suppressing the idea that if Iran is backing countries, what the US is doing is multiple times what Iran seems to have been doing. So I think Iran has certainly sympathies with the Palestinian struggle. Those sympathies extend to its political self-interest in not being attacked. It is lots of problems within its own society. but I think it's dangerous state propaganda that is building up this notion that Iran is the real enemy standing behind this kind of anti-Israeli quote unquote terrorism or criminality, as was evidenced by the October 7th attack. So I really think it's important to try to understand as accurately as possible the limited degree to which Iran is involved in the direct shaping of the conflict.
If I may, Joe, add a
Mhm.
footnote to this, is that if in that survey of public opinion, only 4% of the 8,000 respondents in 16 Arab countries say that Hamas did whatever it did, 4% think that it was in pursuit of a foreign agenda, such as Iran. So 4% are, yeah. So, and then only 5% think that that was something in relation to Arab normalization with Israel. Okay, so the view in Arab countries is that whatever happened since October 7 is totally separate from Iran. But of course, you know, I mean, whatever Dick said is, yes, I mean, they know Iran has a policy that is generally supportive, but there's this kind of a propaganda in this country. Whenever they mention Hezbollah, they say it's supported by Iran. Whenever they mention the Houthis, they're supported by Iran. Whenever they mention Hamas, it's supported by Iran. But it's not viewed the same way from these people in the Arab countries. Yeah, I'll stop at that.
Thank you. I see we lost Irene. I hope she'll be able to rejoin us. There's a question from Nancy Richmond. What is preventing humanitarian aid from getting to the Gazans? Is Israel blocking it, or Hamas taking it, or no one sending it? What can be done to get the food and water to the Gazans?
Well, I can say a couple of things about that. The evidence is that Israel is not entirely blocking it, but substantially restricting the amount of aid that can get through, and has justified the restrictions by saying that it seems to be falling into the hands of Hamas. There's no evidence of that, and there's no reason really to give it much credibility. The real question is how much political will is there to secure the delivery of the desperately needed medical supplies, food, fuel, and that could be a kind of ultimatum to Israel as a step that the governments that have been supportive of it should at least take a minimal step, the least they can do at this point.
Thank you. I'm wondering, Asaf, if you're wanting to come in?
Yeah, well, and full, nothing to add to what Richard said here. One thing I want to point out, this is again looking at my survey, but I took this earlier, and I've taken it from the Arabic. Hamas is not necessarily viewed in a positive way by people, the public opinion. So what I see, what I read is that, of course, like we are here, totally in support of the Palestinian, totally in support of those who are being attacked and killed. There are, it's interesting to me that perceive Hamas as, some of them, I mean, I have the statistic in front of me, that Hamas has acted in some irresponsible way, not in a responsible way. One thing I'd like to say, this is not directly to any question that Joe has raised. A few weeks ago, when Joe got in touch with me and we were talking what I can say, one of the things that came up in the conversation is that perhaps I could look at some of the documents that Hamas itself has produced in Arabic and see where they come from and where they're going. And something that I was preparing myself to say, but we're running out of time, is that, and it's not mentioned in the daily press in the United States, it's not in the media. Of course, some people know about that. That in a way, Hamas, I'm going to say the word, is a creation of Israel. In what sense? For 30 years, from the late 1950s, or from 67 until the late 1980s, Israel was trying to play the Islamist against what the PLO. And invariably, they would come on the side of the Islamists and trying to cut down the PLO. And I have plenty of documentation on that, what they were doing. And in the founding convention that Hamas, well, it was a group before Hamas, and there was at the time someone by the name of Ahmed Yassin, who was the founder of Hamas. He invited to the founding convention the Israeli governor to be present. I mean, just imagine this. Just imagine this. In 1973, there is this group called Al-Mujamma, which is the precursor of Hamas, which came about, was created in 1989. And the guest of honor, listen to this, the guest of honor is the Israeli military governor who is coming to attend the ceremony. Of course, it made all the groups affiliated with the PLO very angry, but that was the context. And Yassin, who was the head of that group, who was also the founder of Hamas, stayed until the first Intifada, stayed out of any resistance, any active resistance against the Israeli occupier, and put all his effort into things like building mosques, cultural clubs, things of that kind. And one has to say this, and I'll stop at that. The number of mosques under the control of Hamas between 67 and 89 doubled. So what you have is like, it's a large number of with, I have to say, Saudi money also, money from the Gulf. So you can see the picture, all right? Things changed dramatically after the first Intifada. And then you had the Oslo Accord in 93, 95. And the things changed. And now the divide and rule game that Israel has been pursuing is how to get the PA, the Palestinian Authority, which is what came after the PLO, how to use the PA to counter Hamas. So they're playing the same game in a different way. But of course, the PA right now, if you look at the statistic, they're not very well viewed. It's a very corrupt setup. Mahmoud Abbas is not, if there were an election today, will not be re-elected. I'll stop at that.
Could I just add a footnote to what Asaf said? While I was special rapporteur for the UN on Israeli violations of human rights and international humanitarian law, I had the opportunity to meet and talk in detail with several of the Hamas leaders who are living either in Doha or Cairo, and also in Gaza. And at that point, and in the period between 2010 2010 and 2014, Hamas was publicly and by back channels pushing for a 50-year ceasefire with Israel, conditioned on Israel carrying out the unanimous Security Council mandate of 67 that Israel withdraw to the pre-67 borders. And neither the US nor Israel would respond to those diplomatic initiatives. And Hamas, Michel particularly, who was perhaps the most intellectual of the leaders, claimed that he warned Washington through reliable sources that if the ceasefire wasn't accepted or negotiated about, it would produce a period of tragic violence for both sides.
It's helpful and helpful news. It brings to mind for me an exchange that I learned of by Matty Peled, who was the number 3 general in Israel at the time of the 67 war. A couple of days after the war, he and Ezra Weitzman, who had been the head of the Air Force, were in East Jerusalem. Peled turned to Weitzman and said, well, now we can create the Palestinian state on our own terms and be free of it. Weitzman responded, what are you, crazy? And there we have the major lost opportunity. Irene, I want to thank you for coming back. If you could adjust your computer screen a little bit, we can't see much more than your eyes and your nose. And I guess I want to follow up on what we've just heard here. Is a question from Yossi McIntyre. I can't see that the Palestinians in Gaza and elsewhere have done much to pressure Hamas to put an end to continued missile attacks against Israel. Could this concern be addressed? So is there any pressure? How are Hamas's missile attacks perceived, supported, opposed by people in Gaza?
You know, I don't have an Joe, I want to intercede here. I don't have an answer to that question, but I do want to ask the person making that question, how do you propose that anyone supporting Hamas or not supporting Hamas can deal with a level of destruction that Israel is responsible for in Gaza, which basically no longer exists? Don't we have to confront that and deal with and take responsibility for the conditions that exist there? What is to follow?
Okay, I'm going to go to just to say someone who will be unnamed has just put a ridiculous number of questions and comments into the Q&A process, which makes it difficult for me, and I'm not going to ask any of that person's questions. Question here from Mike Hager. Where can Palestinians go as the population suffers from famine and continued bombing? And I guess the question kind of related to this, I'd add here, is to what degree do you think Israel is pursuing its so-called the so-called commitment to thinning the Gazan population and to a functional second Nakba?
I mean, this is a criminal policy. I don't know that it has to have a formal name, but this is not a policy that's designed to achieve anything but the decapitation of the Palestinian population. If that's the objective, then one has to ask whether that objective will bring any kind of long-term security to Israel, aside from what it means from a human point of view. I think the answer is negative. So I don't know what it means, the proposal that Israel made that the population simply moves south to where? The Egyptian Sinai? Well, the Egyptians have already indicated that they don't welcome this. This is not a policy. This is some kind of a threat of elimination that is to be carried out.
If I
Would
could
you-
just add that the Israeli campaign after October 7th was not directed toward Hamas's terrorism so much as it was directed toward the forced evacuation of the Palestinians from Gaza and the dispossession in the West Bank. That if Israel really wanted to deal with its own security in a effective way, they're much more efficient and methods that would not have exposed the entire population of civilian population of Gaza to this kind of massive terrorist genocidal attack. And so one has to question the motivations. At best, Israel used the October 7th attack as a pretext for a pre-existing plan to get rid of the Palestinians to the extent they could. And we should remember that before October 7th, and since the Netanyahu coalition government took power, it was known as the most extreme government ever to be elected in Israel. And it gave a green light to settler violence, and it was obviously intent on the end game of the whole Zionist project of claiming territorial sovereignty over the whole of the so-called Promised Land or Greater Israel.
Yeah, I fully agree. I fully agree with what Dick just said. They took what happened on October 7th as a pretext to pursue their plan. And one can see how this is unfolding by looking right now what's happening in the West Bank. Because attention is focused on Gaza, there are all kinds of actions on the West Bank, ethnic cleansing, whole villages are being, their population pushed out. And it's not mentioned in the US media. It is mentioned in the Arab media, by the way. So this is taking place. So this is exactly correct, what Dick just said. It has been used as a pretext to continue with the Nakba that has been going on for 75 years now. It's just, and they thought they can do it because, okay, it was a big attack on October 7th, and it was atrocious, and they thought, okay, that's now our chance to do it.
I'll just jump in with two things. I had a email from a friend of mine, a Palestinian in Washington, who was writing about the danger that his brother faced, a man who had an accident, who was both physically and mentally compromised because of it, and was his community was about to be overrun by the IDF, in a situation where this young man could not cope, and under were he to be arrested, tortured, whatever, he simply would not be able to survive. And there are countless stories like this. So I think as we're having this conversation, I think it's very important for us to, over and above just the broader analytical dimensions of it, to always come back to what it means for individual human beings. And also, while I'm at it, before we go to a couple, maybe two last questions, just to call people's attention to this new book by Raja Shahara, We Could Have Been Friends. He's a lawyer and writer. Actually, The book is a National Book Award finalist here in the United States, and it has a very compelling description of the first Nakba and what Palestinians suffered under Jordanian control. Let's see if I can operate the questions here. There's a question here from Mohammed Kaku. What could be the potential long-term solutions to this conflict? How important is the role of international mediation and organizations in resolving this? This is the big question. What is possible in the medium to long term here?
Joe.
Yes, Irene, I can't see more than your eyes. So
Yeah, well, although I think this question is really directed at Dick, I would like to say that, of course, peace was always a possibility. The absence of war was always a possibility. The question is, in whose interest is on the ongoing war fought? Who profits from it? I think that we really have to ask that kind of a question, both with respect to US support and in Israel itself. Who benefits from the obvious continuation? Of course, you can say the arms industry, but there's also an industry that's built up of a public opinion that is carefully managed, manicured, so that the kinds of questions that are asked, that, for example, this speaker asked, are not asked. How many times in the US press or in US general discourse, whether it's on campuses and more often off, are these kinds of questions raised in an environment that is not hostile? I think that is something that we have a responsibility for, that we can affect.
Richard, Asaf?
Well, one has to establish a different context than the one that exists now. And that means a different outlook on the part of the Western supporters of Israel and a different internal Israeli sense of their own interests, their own future. And it's only when substantive pressure is brought to bear on an elite that has gone to these lengths that this current government in Israel has gone to. It is only something very drastic that can shake it from this orientation that is not just, can't be measured in material interests alone. It is motivated in part by this kind of visionary Zionism of a maximal sort that sees the necessity of finishing the struggle in such a way as to eliminate the indigenous people as an obstacle to Jewish supremacy. And that's characteristic of settler colonial states. They all, including the US and Canada, they all have acted to neutralize or exterminate the indigenous people. And that's, in my view, what this is all about. This is a effort to of maximal Zionism to crush the relevance of Palestinian people. And we should remember that Netanyahu was waving this map around, including in the UN General Assembly, that had no Palestine on it.
Mhm.
And one of the motivations, undoubtedly, of Hamas was to negative the view that Palestine could be erased. And the old slogan of a land a people without a land for a land without a people. That was in this early pre-Balfour Zionist utopian thinking, which erased the Palestinians. As Irene said at the very beginning of our webinar, this is not new. What has happened? It's just an extreme. It's so extreme. It exposes the reality that Israel state propaganda and control of the public discourse has managed to distort and hide over the years. So this is a moment of clarity that shouldn't be diverted by considerations that this is just a matter of bargaining for a mutually acceptable solution.
So I'm going to go with one more question, but before going there, simply to say that I've been, as we watch what's been going on, I've also been thinking that this is how the American West was won, with this kind of brutality. And I also have a memory from 1981, before the Israeli invasion of Lebanon, when I was with a delegation that met with Yasser Arafat. It was not a terribly impressive interview, but one thing he said kind of resonated now across these decades. He says, cowboys and Indians all over again, except this time the world is watching in real time, and it changes the dynamics in a really powerful way. I want to close with this last question here, and there are many more, but I think this is, we can only ask so much of our speakers and our audience here. What about Bernie Sanders' initiative in Congress to investigate human rights abuses by countries that receive U.S. aid? I think he's very explicitly introduced a legislation in relationship to Israel. Is this a positive development? Does this move in the direction of a trying to open a crack for something more fundamental?
Yes.
Yes, I think so.
It's how could it be negative?
Yeah, of course, it will depend on how seriously it's implemented. You know, we look at these formal changes in law as if they're self-enforcing. And what we should have learned is that law is no better, incapable of being effective unless it's backed by effective political enforcement.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to jump in here, and I want to thank each of you for sharing your wisdom, and underneath it, I know your passion as well. I trust that people will be using the recording of this webinar for continued outreach to kind of help build the pressure for the ceasefire that we absolutely need, and for the negotiations and to prevent the war from widening. In thanking our speakers, I want to do two other things. I want to thank Mariana Fernandez, who's invisible, but without whose work and technological skills, we wouldn't be here. And I also want to ask Mariana if she can put on the stage, on the screen, information about the Global Day of Action for Gaza, with the website, and which includes, I think, actions in maybe 33 countries. And people listening to this can find actions where they can join, building that popular pressure that we discussed here. Again, thank you so much. What can we do but all that we can? Thank you very much. Looks like in the chat, here we go. Here is the link in the chat. And I hope people will capture that link or just go to it now and join actions to stop the killing. Thank you. Mariana, I think you can wrap us up here. There she is. Thank you again, Mariana.
This was great. Thank you so much. I'm gonna close now the webinar, but yeah, I will share the link soon.
Thank you.
Thanks again.
Bye, good night.